The recycled air tasted like someone else's Tuesday. Commander Daven Kross had made this observation approximately 412 times during his 3 years aboard the Threshold, and it never became less true. There was something about the ship's atmospheric processors that gave every breath a faint metallic quality, as if the molecules themselves were tired of being used and reused by the same 37 crew members, who had nothing better to do than exist at the edge of known space and wait for aliens who apparently had better things to do than acknowledge humanity's existence. He stood before the holographic star chart in his quarters, watching the blue light paint shadows across his hands as he manipulated the display. Velorian space stretched before him like a dare, thousands of stars that burned with ancient red light, systems that had been old when Earth was still figuring out multicellular life. Somewhere in that vast territory, a civilization watched and waited and refused every attempt at communication with a silence so complete it felt almost personal. "Computer," Daven said, "what's the current status of the Velorian monitoring array?" "All sensors nominal, Commander. No transmissions detected. No vessel activity detected. No anomalous readings detected." The computer's voice carried the same pleasant neutrality it always did, utterly indifferent to the fact that it had delivered this exact report every single day for 3 years. "Wonderful," Daven muttered. "Glad to know we're maintaining humanity's most expensive monument to being ignored." His quarters were small but private, a luxury afforded to senior officers on diplomatic vessels. The Threshold had been designed for first contact scenarios, which meant comfortable meeting rooms, sophisticated translation systems, and quarters that wouldn't embarrass humanity in front of hypothetical alien guests. What the designers hadn't anticipated was that the aliens might simply choose never to show up, leaving the crew to rattle around in spaces meant for negotiations that never happened. Daven had personalized his space in small ways over the years. A worn paperback copy of Meditations sat on his desk, its pages soft from repeated reading. A photograph of his sister Mara was magnetically attached to the wall, showing her laughing at something outside the frame, her dark hair caught mid-motion. Beside it hung a letter he had started writing to her 6 months ago and never finished, the words feeling increasingly inadequate to bridge the distance between them. He was 41 years old, and he had spent more time talking to a computer than to another human being in the past week. The midnight watch had always been his favorite shift, back when he flew combat missions and midnight meant something, meant stars wheeling past the cockpit, and the particular alertness that came from knowing danger could arrive at any moment. Now midnight was just an arbitrary designation, the ship's AI dimming the lights to simulate a day-night cycle that had no relationship to any actual sun. He kept the old habit anyway, reviewing charts and reports while the rest of the crew slept, pretending that his vigilance mattered. The star chart flickered. Daven frowned, tapping the display to run a diagnostic. The holographic systems on the Threshold were top of the line, supposedly immune to the glitches that plagued older vessels. But the image wavered again, blue light stuttering like a candle flame in wind that shouldn't exist in the climate-controlled air. "Computer, run a diagnostic on." He stopped. She was standing in the corner of his room. For a moment that stretched into something longer than seconds could measure, Daven's mind simply refused to process what his eyes reported. There had been no door chime, no shimmer of transport technology, no sound of any kind. One instant the corner was empty, containing only the shadow cast by his reading lamp, and the next instant she was there, utterly still, watching him with eyes that seemed to contain more darkness than the space between stars. His hand moved toward his sidearm without conscious thought, a reflex trained into him by years of combat service. But even as his fingers touched the weapon's grip, he recognized the absurdity of the gesture. She had bypassed 17 security protocols. 17. He had helped design some of those protocols. If she wanted him dead, a pistol would be meaningless. She was beautiful in a way that made the word seem insufficient, like using wet to describe an ocean. Her skin held a luminescence that reminded him of moonlight on fresh snow, pale and faintly glowing in the dim blue light of his quarters. Her hair fell past her shoulders in waves of absolute black, so dark it seemed to absorb the ambient glow rather than reflect it. And her ears, long and elegantly pointed, swept back along the sides of her head, marked her as something other than human, something older, something that had walked among stars while humanity was still learning to walk at all. Velorian. The word surfaced in his mind with the weight of 3 years of waiting, 3 years of silence, 3 years of wondering if they even knew or cared that humanity had stationed a ship at their border like a child, pressing their face against a window. "How did you?" he started, and his voice cracked embarrassingly on the second word. He cleared his throat, tried again. "How did you get in here?" She did not answer, she did not move. She stood with a stillness that seemed to extend beyond mere physical motionlessness into something almost geological, as if she had always been standing there and would continue standing there long after he and his ship and his entire species had crumbled into dust. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room without seeming to originate from her lips. It was not a loud voice, but it penetrated, sliding past his ears and settling somewhere in the center of his chest. "When your species dreams," she said, "do you see the faces of those you have not yet met?" Daven opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. In his 30 years of military and diplomatic service, he had been trained to respond to countless scenarios. Hostile contact, emergency decompression, first contact protocols, even the theoretical possibility of telepathic communication. No one had ever trained him for a beautiful alien woman appearing in his quarters at midnight to ask him about his dreams. "I what?" She tilted her head slightly, and the motion was eerily graceful, like watching water flow. Her dark eyes held no impatience, only that vast and patient stillness, waiting. "I don't understand the question," Daven managed. "Dreams are just their neural activity during sleep, random firings of." But she was gone. Not gone as in she had left, walked out through a door, or transported away in a shimmer of light. Gone as in she had simply ceased to be present. The corner of his room returning to emptiness so completely that for one dizzying moment Daven wondered if she had ever been there at all. The only evidence that remained was a scent, faint and fading, something like rain on soil that had never known earth, like petrichor from a world with 3 suns. Daven stood motionless for a long time, his hand still resting on his sidearm, his heart performing rhythms his physician would have found concerning. The star chart continued its slow rotation, blue light painting the walls in patterns that suddenly seemed less like data and more like questions he had never thought to ask. "When your species dreams, do you see the faces of those you have not yet met?" He thought about the dreams he'd been having lately, the ones that slipped away like water through fingers when he woke, leaving only impressions of vast spaces and impossible architecture, and a face he could never quite remember. "Computer," he said finally, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "Did sensors detect any unauthorized entry into my quarters in the past hour?" "Negative, Commander. No unauthorized entries detected. All security protocols functioning normally." He laughed, and the sound was not entirely sane. Of course the sensors had detected nothing. Why would they? She had walked through 17 layers of security like they were made of suggestion rather than quantum-encrypted force fields. Daven sank into his chair and stared at the photograph of his sister, at her frozen laughter, at the way the light caught her hair. He thought about calling someone, reporting the contact that humanity had waited 3 years to achieve. He thought about the psychological evaluation that would follow, the questions about stress and isolation, and whether the commander of the threshold had finally cracked under the weight of cosmic loneliness. He thought about her question, turning it over in his mind like a stone that might contain something valuable if he could only find the right angle. "When your species dreams, Do you see the faces of those you have not yet met? The recycled air still tasted like someone else's Tuesday. But for the first time in 3 years, Daven Kross felt wide awake. 3 days passed before Daven accepted that he was not going to tell anyone about the visitation. He had composed the report 17 times, each version more clinical than the last, each one deleted before he could submit it. The words looked wrong on the screen, reducing something vast and strange to bureaucratic notation. Velorian contact achieved at 2:47 hours, single question posed regarding human dream states, subject departed through unknown means. It read like a joke, and he was not certain anyone would laugh. Instead, he began to research. The Thresholds database contained everything humanity knew about the Velorians, which turned out to be frustratingly little. Most information came from artifacts recovered on abandoned moons in the border regions, objects whose purpose remained unclear even after decades of analysis. There were crystalline structures that seemed to resonate at frequencies just below human hearing, metallic tablets covered in script that translation algorithms could only partially decode, and architectural fragments that suggested buildings designed for beings who experienced space differently than humans did. The Velorians themselves remained shadows, glimpsed occasionally on long-range sensors, their vessels moving through space in patterns that made no tactical sense until you realized they weren't thinking tactically at all. "You look terrible," Chief Engineer Tamaz Reyes announced, sliding into the seat across from Daven in the mess hall. He was a compact man with perpetually oil-stained hands and an expression that suggested the universe was a machine he hadn't quite finished disassembling. "When did you last sleep? And I mean actual sleep, not that thing you do where you close your eyes and pretend the stars aren't judging you." Daven looked up from his tablet, where a Velorian philosophical text was refusing to make sense in any of the 12 languages the translation software had attempted. "I sleep fine." "You sleep like a man who owes money to someone who knows where he lives." Tamaz gestured at the tablet. "What are you reading? Please tell me it's not another personnel evaluation. I can't handle another memo about optimal wrench storage." "Velorian metaphysics." Tamaz paused with his coffee halfway to his lips. "I'm sorry, did you say Velorian metaphysics? As in, the aliens who won't return our calls?" "That Velorian metaphysics." "Light reading." "Right, because when I can't sleep, I also turn to the incomprehensible philosophy of species that treat us like we're mildly interesting bacteria." Tamaz set down his cup. "Seriously, Commander, what's going on? You've been weird for days, weirder than usual, and your usual is already pretty weird." Daven considered telling him. Tamaz was perhaps the closest thing he had to a friend on the threshold, a man whose irreverence masked genuine competence and whose loyalty had been proven in a dozen small crises over their 3 years together. But how could he explain that an alien woman had appeared in his quarters like a ghost, asked him about his dreams, and vanished before he could formulate a response? How could he describe the way her presence had felt, ancient and patient, and somehow familiar in a way that made no logical sense? "Just thinking about first contact protocols," Daven said instead. "Wondering if we've been approaching this wrong the whole time." "We've definitely been approaching it wrong. You know what our problem is. We keep trying to be professional." Tamaz leaned back in his chair. 3 years of formal transmissions, diplomatic language, carefully worded invitations to cultural exchange. "You know what we should do? Send them a joke. Something really stupid. Why did the human cross the galaxy? To get to the other species. See if they have a sense of humor." "I'm not sure that's in the First Contact Handbook." "The handbook was written by people who have never actually contacted anyone. We're out here making it up as we go." Tamaz shrugged. "Besides, maybe the Velorians are just waiting for us to be interesting. Have you considered that? Maybe they've seen 1,000 species show up at their border with the same boring speeches about peace and cooperation, and they're just tired of it." The thought landed somewhere unexpected in Daven's mind. When your species dreams, do you see the faces of those you have not yet met? It was certainly not a boring question. It was not anything close to the diplomatic exchanges humanity had prepared for. What do you know about Velorian communication? Daven asked. Not the official stuff, the rumors, the speculation. Tamaz raised an eyebrow. You mean the crazy theories Lieutenant Tanaka keeps trying to tell everyone about during lunch? Maybe. Well, Tamaz glanced around the mess hall, which was empty except for a junior officer dozing over cold coffee in the corner. Yuki thinks they're telepathic. Not just ship-to-ship communication telepathic, but deep telepathic, like they can read thoughts across light years. She says it explains why they never respond to our transmissions. They already know what we're going to say before we say it. Daven thought about the voice that had filled his quarters, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. What else? Some people think they don't experience time the way we do. That they see past and future simultaneously, which is why they seem so indifferent to our requests for meetings. To them, the meeting has already happened, or will happen, or is happening right now in some way we can't perceive. Tamaz spread his hands. Personally, I think they're just snobs. Advanced species get that way sometimes. Oh, you've only been spacefaring for 3 centuries. How quaint. That night alone in his quarters, Daven dreamed. He stood in a temple of white stone beneath a sky he had never seen. 3 suns hung at different heights, casting triple shadows that shifted and overlapped in patterns his mind struggled to interpret. The architecture around him was wrong in subtle ways. Doorways too tall, corridors that curved when they should have been straight, windows that looked out onto vistas that changed each time he glanced at them. And she was there. Selira sat on a bench carved from something that might have been marble if marble could hold light inside itself like captured starfire. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders in the same impossible waves he remembered from his quarters. But here, she seemed less alien somehow, or perhaps more alien in a way that felt natural rather than strange. Her long ears caught the light from the 3 suns, and she watched him approach with those deep dark eyes that contained multitudes. "You came," she said, and her voice did not fill the space the way it had before. Here it was simply a voice, beautiful and clear, with harmonics that suggested she was speaking not just with her throat but with something deeper. "I don't know where I am," Daven said, and the words felt thick in his mouth, dream words that carried more weight than waking speech. "You are where you have always been. You are simply seeing it now." He sat beside her on the bench, and the stone was warm against his body, warm like sunlight or memory. "Your question, the one you asked me. I don't know how to answer it." "You don't know how to answer it yet," she corrected gently. "But you will, you have. Time is not what your species believes it to be." "Then what is it?" She turned to face him fully, and he saw something in her expression that might have been sorrow or might have been hope, emotions translated imperfectly across the gulf between their kinds. "A conversation," she said, "between all things that are and all things that will be and all things that might have been. Your people speak it with your mouths, word by word. My people speak it with our minds all at once, but it is the same conversation." Daven woke with the taste of alien air in his lungs, and the image of 3 pale suns burned into his vision like afterimages. His clock showed 3:12 hours. His sheets were soaked with sweat, and his heart was racing, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear her voice saying words he could no longer quite remember. He reached for his tablet and began to write. "If you've watched this far, what brought you to this video? I'd be really happy if you share it in the comments. Don't forget to like the video to support me." The classified archive required 3 levels of authorization that Daven technically possessed, and 2 that he creatively reinterpreted. He told himself it was not a violation of protocol so much as an expansion of his duties. After all, if the Velorians had finally made contact with humanity, surely the commander of the border station had a right to know everything humanity had learned about them. The fact that this contact had occurred in his private quarters, and consisted of a single cryptic question, was a detail he chose not to include in his internal justification. The files were old, some dating back to the earliest days of human expansion into this region of space. They had been compiled by a succession of researchers, diplomats, and intelligence officers, each one adding their observations to a growing picture that somehow became less clear the more information it contained. Reading them felt like assembling a puzzle where the pieces came from different boxes. Dr. Amara Okonkwo to Commander Kross. Are you planning to grace the medical bay with your presence this week, or should I send the equipment to your quarters? Daven tapped the comm panel without looking away from the scrolling text. I'm fine, Doctor. You've missed 2 scheduled checkups. Your biometric data suggests you've averaged 3 hours of sleep per night for the past week. And Lieutenant Tanaka tells me you've been asking strange questions about Velorian consciousness theory. There was a pause. I'm not sure which of those concerns me most. The sleep thing is temporary. It always is, until it isn't. Amara's voice carried the particular patience of a physician who had spent 30 years learning that officers lied about their health, the way children lied about eating vegetables. I'm coming to your quarters in 1 hour. You can either be there, or you can explain to Admiral Chen why the Threshold's commander is avoiding routine medical evaluation. The comm clicked off before he could argue. Daven sighed and returned to the archives. The earliest relevant file was a report from the survey vessel Meridian, which had encountered Velorian artifacts on an unnamed moon 62 years ago. The captain, a woman named Vasquez, had written extensively about the strange crystalline structures they discovered in a cave system, objects that hummed at frequencies that made her crew uneasy in ways they couldn't articulate. 3 crew members reported vivid dreams during their time on the moon. One of them, a junior engineer, had written in her personal log that she dreamed of conversations with beings she had never met, in places she had never been. Daven read that sentence 3 times. The next significant file came from 20 years later, a diplomatic mission to the edge of Velorian space, not unlike the Threshold's current assignment. The mission commander, a man named Yusuf al-Rashid, had reported a visitation in his quarters. A Velorian woman had appeared without warning, asked him a question, and disappeared. The question was not recorded in the official report, but al-Rashid's personal notes, appended to the file by a later archivist, contained a single line. She asked if I dream of the dead. Al-Rashid had requested transfer 2 weeks later. He died of a stroke 6 months after that, aged 43. The third file was worse. A researcher named Chen Wei had devoted her career to studying recovered Velorian texts, working alone on a remote station because the artifacts she studied had effects on human psychology that made them unsuitable for populated areas. Her final report, submitted 3 days before her disappearance, contained a passage that made Daven's chest tight. I believe the Velorians do not communicate telepathically in the way we understand the term. They exist partially in a dimension of consciousness that we access only during sleep. What we call dreams, they call reality. What we call reality, they consider a kind of persistent dream from which most species never wake. They have been watching us dream for centuries, waiting for individuals whose minds reach beyond the ordinary boundaries. I do not know what they want from such individuals. I am not certain I want to know. Chen Wei was never found. Her station showed no signs of struggle, no evidence of departure. She had simply ceased to exist between one security log and the next. Cheerful reading. Daven startled so badly, he nearly knocked the tablet off his desk. Dr. Amara Okonkwo stood in his doorway, medical kit in hand, eyebrow raised in an expression that suggested she had been standing there for longer than was comfortable. You said 1 hour. I said 1 hour 47 minutes ago. You didn't answer my chime. She stepped inside without waiting for invitation, her practiced eye sweeping across his quarters. The unmade bed, the scattered tablets, the empty coffee containers that had begun to form their own small civilization on his desk. When did you last eat something that wasn't caffeine? Coffee has nutritional value. Coffee has the nutritional value of spite and desperation. She set down her kit and gestured at the chair. Sit. Let me pretend to examine you, while you pretend to be honest about how you're feeling. Daven sat. Amara ran her scanner over him with the efficient movements of long practice, her face revealing nothing as data scrolled across the small screen. She was perhaps 60. With gray-streaked hair she kept short and practical, and eyes that had seen enough of human frailty to be neither surprised nor judgmental about any of it. Your cortisol levels are elevated, she said finally. Your sleep patterns show REM irregularities I've never encountered before, and your neural activity during rest periods is. She paused, frowning at the scanner. Unusual. Unusual how? The kind of unusual I'd expect from someone undergoing intensive meditation or sensory deprivation experiments, except you're not doing either of those things. She looked up at him. Are you? No. Then what are you doing, Commander? Because something is happening in that brain of yours, and I'd rather understand it before it becomes a problem I have to report. Daven considered his options. Amara had served on deep space vessels for most of her career. She had seen isolation psychosis, had treated officers who swore they'd received messages from dead relatives, had guided countless crew members through the particular loneliness of being very far from home for very long. If anyone on this ship might believe him, it would be her. Have you ever treated patients who reported contact with the Velorians? He asked carefully. Amara's expression shifted, becoming very still. Why do you ask? Because I've been reading the classified archives. 3 documented cases of Velorian visitation to human officers. All of them experienced sleep disturbances afterward. 2 of them died within a year. 1 disappeared completely. And you think you're experiencing something similar? It was not a question. Daven met her eyes, and whatever she saw in his face made her set down the scanner and sit on the edge of his bed, suddenly looking less like a physician and more like someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. The dreams, she said quietly. You've been having the dreams. How do you know about the dreams? Amara was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because 30 years ago, when I was a young doctor on my first deep space assignment, a woman appeared in my quarters in the middle of the night. She had skin like moonlight and ears like something out of mythology, and she asked me a question I've never been able to forget. Daven felt the world shift beneath him. What did she ask you? Amara smiled, but there was no humor in it. She asked if I could hear the heartbeat of stars. The observation deck was empty at this hour, which was precisely why Daven had chosen it. The vast transparent dome curved above him like a bubble of glass separating warmth from the infinite cold, and through it the stars of Velorian space burned with their ancient reddish light. He had been coming here every night for 2 weeks, sitting in the same chair, watching the same unchanging vista, waiting for something he could not name. Amara's confession had changed everything and nothing. She had not seen the Velorian woman again after that single visitation 30 years ago, had not experienced the dreams that now visited Daven with increasing intensity. Whatever test the question represented, she had apparently failed it, or perhaps simply been measured and found suitable for a different purpose. She had become a healer, spending her life tending to the fragile bodies of those who ventured too far from home. Perhaps that was answer enough. But Daven's dreams were growing stronger. He no longer simply visited the temple of white stone beneath the 3 pale suns. Now he walked through cities that spiraled upward into clouds of colored gas, through libraries where books wrote themselves as he watched, through gardens where the flowers sang in harmonies that made his heart ache with a longing he could not explain. And always, Salira was there, guiding him through landscapes that felt more real than the metal corridors of the threshold, speaking to him in a language that translated itself directly into understanding. You're going to wear a groove in that chair. Daven turned to find Tamaz standing at the entrance to the observation deck, 2 steaming cups in his hands. The engineer crossed the room and offered one to Daven, then settled into the adjacent seat with a sigh that spoke of long shifts and complicated machinery. I brought the good stuff, Tamaz said. Traded Lieutenant Vasquez my dessert rations for a month to get real coffee beans. Figured you could use something that doesn't taste like recycled disappointment. Daven accepted the cup, and the aroma alone was enough to make him realize how long it had been since he'd experienced anything that wasn't filtered through the ship's standard processing. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. There's an ulterior motive. Tamaz sipped his own coffee, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond the dome. The crew is worried about you, Commander. You've been distant, distracted. Yuki thinks you've been possessed by alien consciousness. I told her that was ridiculous, but honestly I'm not sure anymore. I'm not possessed. That's exactly what someone possessed by alien consciousness would say. Daven laughed despite himself, and the sound felt strange in his throat, rusty from disuse. I've just been thinking about our mission, about what we're really doing out here. We're waiting, Tamaz said simply. That's all we've ever been doing, waiting for something to happen that probably never will. 3 years of waiting, and the most exciting thing that's happened is when the food synthesizer glitched and produced nothing but variations on oatmeal for a week. He paused. Actually, that wasn't exciting. That was a war crime. But what if they've been waiting too? Tamaz turned to look at him. What do you mean? The Velorians. What if they've been waiting for something specific? Not a treaty or a diplomatic exchange, but something else entirely. Something we wouldn't even recognize as communication. You've been reading too much philosophy, Commander, or not enough. I can never tell which one makes people start talking like that. The observation deck fell silent except for the subtle hum of the ship systems, the constant background noise that became invisible after enough time in space. Daven watched the stars and thought about all the conversations happening right now, across all those light years, in languages humanity had never heard and might never understand. Tamaz, he said quietly, have you ever dreamed about places you've never been? Everyone dreams about places they've never been. That's what dreams are. No, I mean. Daven struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. Dreams that feel like memories. Like you're remembering something that happened to you, except it couldn't have happened because you've never been there. Tamaz was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its usual humor. Once, when I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11, I dreamed about a beach with black sand and water that glowed blue at night. I could feel the sand between my toes, taste the salt in the air. I woke up crying because I missed it so much, this place I'd never actually been. Did you ever find out if it was real? My grandmother told me it sounded like a beach on the northern coast of her home island, a place she'd visited as a girl before it was destroyed in a volcanic eruption. Tamaz shook his head. I'd never seen pictures, she'd never described it to me, but somehow I dreamed her memory or something like it. The words hung in the recycled air between them. Daven thought about consciousness as a field rather than a product, about minds extending beyond bodies like ripples in an infinite ocean. He thought about the Velorians watching humanity dream for centuries, waiting for individuals whose minds reached beyond ordinary boundaries. I think something is happening to me, Daven said, and the admission felt like releasing a breath he'd been holding for weeks. I think the Velorians have been trying to communicate with us all along, but not through transmissions or diplomatic channels, through something else, something deeper. Tamaz studied him with an expression that was difficult to read. Are you telling me you've made contact? I don't know what I'm telling you. I don't know what's real anymore. Daven gestured at the stars beyond the dome. But I know that I've been dreaming about someone out there, and she's been dreaming about me, and somehow that means something. Somehow that's supposed to be the answer to a question I didn't even know was being asked. Well, Tamaz finished his coffee and set the empty cup aside. That's either the most profound thing I've ever heard or the clearest sign of isolation psychosis in the textbook. Possibly both. What would you do if you were me? I'd keep waiting, Tamaz said without hesitation. That's what we're good at out here, waiting for things that might never come and being ready for them anyway. If your alien dream woman wants to have a conversation, she knows where to find you. He stood, clapping Daven on the shoulder with rough affection. Get some sleep, Commander. Real sleep if you can manage it. Whatever's coming, you'll want to be rested for it. Daven watched him go, then turned back to the stars. The observation deck was silent again, but the silence felt different now, expectant rather than empty, like the pause between question and answer. He thought about Selira's face in his dreams, the way she looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to contain entire civilizations. He thought about the question she had asked him that first night, the question that had consumed him for weeks. When your species dreams, do you see the faces of those you have not yet met? He had seen her face. He knew that now with a certainty that transcended logic or evidence. He had seen her face in dreams for years, long before the threshold, long before he knew the Velorians existed, long before any of this had seemed possible. She had been there in the background of his unconscious mind, a presence he had never quite recognized until she stepped out of shadow and into the blue light of his quarters. The question was no longer whether he had seen her. The question was what it meant that she had seen him too. Daven settled deeper into his chair and fixed his eyes on the distant red stars. He would wait. That was what he was good at. And sooner or later she would come. She came on a night when the ship's artificial dawn was still hours away, materializing on the observation deck as if she had always been there, and Daven had simply failed to notice until now. He did not startle this time. He had been waiting for 3 weeks, and some part of him had known she would choose this place, this hour, this particular arrangement of stars beyond the transparent dome. "You knew I would come," Selira said, and her voice no longer seemed to arrive from everywhere at once. It was simply her voice, clear and resonant, carrying harmonics that suggested depths beneath depths. "I hoped." Daven rose from his chair but did not approach her. She stood near the curved glass, her luminescent skin casting faint reflections against the dome, her dark hair falling like ink across shoulders that held themselves with the patience of millennia. "I've been dreaming about you, about your world, about temples and cities and skies I've never seen. You have seen them, you simply do not remember seeing them." She turned to face him fully, and her long ears caught the light from distant stars. "Your mind has been touching ours for years, Daven Kross. Long before you came to this border, long before your species knew we existed. You were dreaming us into existence, and we were dreaming you. I don't understand." "No, but you are beginning to." She moved toward the glass, pressing her palm against the barrier between warmth and void. "My people were not always what we are now. Once we were solid, limited, mortal in ways your kind would recognize. We lived in bodies that aged, minds that forgot, hearts that broke. We died, and those who loved us mourned, and the universe continued without us." Daven stepped closer, drawn by the weight of what she was saying. "What changed?" "We learned to dream together, not as individuals, each trapped in their own unconscious landscapes, but as a single continuous mind. We discovered that consciousness is not contained within flesh. It extends, connects, persists. We became something larger than ourselves." Her reflection in the glass was ghostly, translucent. "But we lost something too, the private mystery of sleep, the faces that appear unbidden in the night, the strange gift of dreaming alone." "You gave up individual dreams. We merged them, a collective current that grants us power over space and matter, that allows us to step between places as easily as you step between thoughts." She turned to look at him, and her dark eyes held something that might have been grief. "But we cannot dream new dreams anymore. We can only remember the dreams we had before, cycling through the same visions like recordings played endlessly. We are vast and ancient and terribly, terribly lonely." The observation deck hummed with the ship's quiet systems, life support and gravity generators, and all the machinery that kept fragile humans alive in the hostile dark. Daven thought about his own dreams, the vivid, impossible landscapes that had felt more real than waking. He thought about Chen Wei's final report, about minds that reach beyond ordinary boundaries. "That's why you search," he said slowly. "That's why you watch younger species. You're looking for dreamers. We are looking for minds like yours, rare, precious, individuals whose consciousness extends naturally beyond the boundaries of their bodies, whose dreams touch the deeper current we sacrificed everything to access." Selira's voice softened. "You have been dreaming me for years, Daven, and I have been dreaming you. We created each other across the void without knowing, without intending. When I came to your quarters and asked my question, I already knew the answer. I simply needed to hear you say it. Then why ask? Because the asking mattered, because choice matters. Because we learned long ago that taking minds without consent leads to horrors we have spent millennia atoning for." She crossed the distance between them, and she was close enough now that he could see the subtle luminescence of her skin, the way light seemed to live inside her rather than reflect from her surface. "I am offering you something, Daven Kross, not taking, offering." His heart was beating faster than it should, but not from fear. "What are you offering?" "Connection, understanding. The chance to know what we know, to see what we see, to dream with us rather than alone." She raised her hand, and her fingers hovered near his face without quite touching. "If you accept, you will change. You will still be yourself, but you will also be more. You will carry a piece of my people within you, and we will carry a piece of you within us. The loneliness you have felt on this ship, the sense of waiting for something you could not name, it will end. But so will the simplicity of being only human." Daven thought about his life before this assignment. The combat missions, the friends he had lost, the sister he had not seen in 4 years. He thought about the letter he kept rewriting, the photograph of Mara laughing at something outside the frame. He thought about Tamaz and his terrible coffee, Amara and her unanswered question, the crew who had become something like family during 3 years of waiting at the edge of the unknown. "Will I lose them?" he asked, "the people I care about here?" "You will lose nothing. You will gain perspectives that will help you understand them better." Selira's lips curved in what might have been a smile. "You will also gain the ability to appear in places without using doors, which I understand humans find unsettling. You may want to warn your crew." Daven laughed, and the sound surprised him, breaking the solemnity of the moment. "Is that how you do it? Dream yourself into places?" "Something like that. It is more complicated, but your language does not have words for the precise mechanics." Her smile widened slightly. "Your engineer would be frustrated. He likes to understand how things work. Tamaz would probably take you apart to figure out the mechanism. He would be welcome to try. We appreciate curiosity, even when it leads to impossible questions." The stars beyond the dome continued their slow, ancient burning, light from civilizations that had risen and fallen, while humanity was still learning to walk upright. Daven looked at them, then looked at Selira, then looked at his own hands, ordinary human hands that had piloted ships and signed orders and held the weight of command for years. "I used to think waiting was the hardest part," he said. 3 years on this ship, watching that border, hoping something would happen. But the waiting wasn't hard. The hard part was not knowing what I was waiting for. And now you know. Now I know." He met her eyes, those dark depths that contained multitudes. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I was supposed to be somewhere else, doing something important that I couldn't quite identify. Like there was a conversation happening just beyond my hearing, and if I could only listen hard enough, I would finally understand." "You were hearing us," Selira said softly. "You were always hearing us. We simply had not learned to speak clearly enough for you to understand." Daven took a breath that felt like the first breath of a new life. He thought about the dreams that had haunted him, the faces that had appeared unbidden in his sleep, the sense of meaning that had always seemed just out of reach. He thought about what it would mean to finally, truly understand. Yes, he said. My answer to your question is yes. I have seen the faces of those I had not yet met. I saw you, Selira, for years before I knew you existed. And if that means something, if that connection is real, then I want to understand it. I want to know what it means to dream together. Selira's hand finally touched his face, and her skin was warm against his, warmer than he expected, alive with a pulse that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. The stars beyond the dome seemed to shift, to brighten, as if responding to something that had just changed in the fabric of reality itself. Then we begin, she said. The ship's lights chose that moment to shift from dim blue to amber, the artificial dawn beginning its slow simulation of a sunrise that had no relationship to any actual sun. But it felt appropriate somehow, light growing where there had been darkness, warmth spreading through a space that had been cold for too long. Daven looked at the woman who had stepped out of his dreams and into his life, and for the first time since he had been assigned to the threshold, he did not feel like he was waiting for something. He felt like he had finally arrived.